This is the family tree of Jesus the Anointed, who was a descendant of David and Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac of Jacob, Jacob of Judah and his brothers. Judah and Tamar were the parents of Perez and Zerah. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, and Salmon and Rahab were the parents of Boaz. Boaz and Ruth were the parents of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse of David the king. David and Uriah's wife were the parents of Solomon. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam of Abijah, Abijah of Asaph, Asaph of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat of Joram, Joram of Uzziah, Uzziah of Jotham, Jotham of Ahaz, Ahaz of Hezekiah, Hezekiah of Manasseh, Manasseh of Amos, Amos of Josiah, and Josiah was the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the Babylonian exile, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, Salathiel of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel of Abiud, Abiud of Eliakim, Eliakim of Azor, Azor of Zadok, Zadok of Achim, Achim of Elihud, Elihud of Eleazar, Eleazar of Mathan, Mathan of Jacob, and Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, who was the mother of Jesus. Jesus is known as the Anointed. In sum, the generations from Abraham to David come to 14. Those from David to the Babylonian exile, number 14. And those from the Babylonian exile to the Anointed amount to 14 also. So, since we've celebrated International Women's Day this week, I thought it would be interesting to look at the women whose stories Matthew thought worth remembering by his fellow Christians. Since Joseph, and therefore Jesus, wasn't important enough to have his ancestry permanently recorded, other than that he belonged to the tribe of Judah, Matthew and Luke, who also recorded the genealogy of Jesus in chapters 3, pretty much made things up as they went along. Most names are different, and those that are the same show up in different places. Now, in this time, family meant father's family, not mother's, women only being living incubators for unborn children. And that's why the Old Testament and Luke's genealogies only name males. But Matthew lists not one, but 3 women along with the men. And that's unheard of. And not just ordinary women, but women who were incredibly brave, not just for themselves, but for others. And 2 of those women were foreigners. So why did Matthew think these women's stories were so important that he tied them to Jesus? Let me repeat them. Tamar, daughter-in-law of Judah, Jesus's tribal ancestor. Rahab, Canaanite, resident of Jericho when Joshua and the Israelites arrived to claim the land that Yahweh promised to Jacob and Abraham. Ruth, Moabite, daughter-in-law of Naomi and David's great-grandmother. So, first, Tamar, from Genesis 38. Judah had 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Being a good patriot, he arranged for Er to marry a neighbor girl, Tamar. But Er was wicked in God's sight, so Yahweh killed him. And since Er and Tamar had no children, his brother Onan was supposed to give Tamar children in Er's name, children that would inherit Judah's wealth ahead of him, the second born. Not happy about that division of his inheritance, Onan withdrew prematurely and spilled his seed upon the ground. And now you know why coitus interruptus used to be called onanism. Yahweh thought this too was evil, and he killed Onan. Shelah was then supposed to father children in Er's name, but because he was underage, Judah sent Tamar back to her father to wait until the boy was old enough. But years passed. Shelah grew up, and Tamar still lived in her father's house, neither wife nor widow, and unable to remarry. Judah's wife died, and the following spring, when his time of mourning was over, unquote, he decided to go to Timnah for the sheep shearing festival, which was an excuse for a lot of, what would we call it? Yeah, yeah, ruckus, yes. Hearing of this and tired of living in limbo, Tamar took matters into her own hands. She laid aside her widow's weeds, dressed up in her sexiest clothes, wrapped herself in a long veil, and headed to Enaim, a village on the road to Timnah. Once there, she set herself up as a cult prostitute and waited for Judah to pass by, which he did. Now, Judah had been a widower for several months, and he was randy. He wanted this woman, and he offered her a choice kid from his flock in payment. Tamar asked for something as a pledge, and he gave her his signet ring, his cord of chieftainship, and his staff. And the man must have been really randy. Just one of those would have been enough to pay for a kid. Judah got what he paid for and went on to Timnah while Tamar went home to her family. Judah sent his friend Hira back to Enam with a promised kid, but Hira couldn't find the woman, and moreover, the townsfolk didn't know anything about a cult prostitute in their village. Judah gave up on the search rather than be a laughingstock in front of his family and his servants. 3 months passed, and Judah learned that Tamar was pregnant. Enraged, he showed up at her father's house and demanded that she be burned as an adulteress. And as she was being brought out, Tamar showed everyone the ring, the cord, and the staff, saying, "Take note, please, whose these are." Judah acknowledged that they were his, adding that Tamar is more righteous than I. Tamar had twin boys, which, by the way, seems to have been a mark of Yahweh's special approval. Perez, the younger twin, is listed in both Matthew and Luke as Judah's son and Jesus' direct ancestor. Kudos to Judah, by the way, for acknowledging his unborn children. Fast forward a couple of hundred years or so to Rahab, and her story is in 2 parts, Joshua 2 and 6. After Moses' death, Joshua took command of the Israelites who had arrived on the east bank of the River Jordan to take the land that the Lord had promised to their ancestor Jacob. Being a prudent general, Joshua sent 2 men to reconnoiter the land and get a feel for if and how their opponents were preparing for battle. The men arrived in Jericho, Canaan's largest city, and found shelter in a house by the city walls owned by a woman named Rahab. The Old Testament calls her a prostitute, but what would a prostitute need with enough flax to bury 2 grown men in, which is exactly what she did? It's more likely she was either a weaver or a merchant seller. But whatever she did for a living, Rahab decided that this new God and his followers were better than the gods she lived with. She hid the 2 Israelites, and when the city guards came looking for them, she lied and said that they'd slipped out the gates before they were closed for the night, and encouraged the guards to, quote, "Hurry, I'm sure you'll catch them." The Israelites promised, "Our lives for yours," not only her life, but all her family and any who are with you in your house. They gave her a red cord to hang in her window as a sign to the army to leave them alone. Rahab gave them directions back to the Jordan, helped them leave town, and hung the red cord as directed, and waited, and watched the Israelites circle the walls every day for a week, heard the trumpets blare on the 7th day, and watched the walls of her city crumble around her house, and no doubt prayed to her new God that the Israelites would keep their word. And they did. Rahab and all that belonged to her were brought out safely and have lived in Israel ever since. As for her marrying into Judah's tribe, there is a bit of a problem. Matthew says she married Salmon, the father of Boaz, but Boaz lived a couple of hundred years later than Joshua. And there's more about Boaz coming up. No one knows where Matthew heard the story, or even if he made it up, but it's clear that he wanted to make sure Rahab was remembered by his fellow Christians and chose this method to do so. And it worked. Both the anonymous author of the letter to the Hebrews and Jesus's brother James praised her as righteous before the Lord. And then there's Ruth. Matthew couldn't ignore her even if he'd wanted to. For one thing, she is David's great-grandmother, and for another, she's one of only 2 women whose stories are important enough to have books named after them. The other is Esther, who descended from Benjamin. I think if asked to name books of the Bible, most people could name Genesis and the Gospels. And then after floundering for a bit, they could probably come up with Job and Ruth. The trials of Job have been a cliche for 3,000 years. But why Ruth? For 2 reasons. Ruth's speech to Naomi as they set out for Israel has been cited in weddings, religious, non-religious, gay, and straight, for as long as we've talked about the trials of Job. It's a beautiful statement of love and devotion. Do not ask me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. And the other reason is this. Ruth is the prototype for every Cinderella story ever written. And believe me, every language has one. Names, countries, circumstances, and helpers change, but the basic story doesn't. Impoverished, often abused, but noble and beautiful young woman earns the love of a good and wealthy man who marries her. Cinderella has her Prince Charming, and Ruth her mother-in-law's kinsman Boaz. I did tell you we'd be talking about him later. Cinderella and her prince live happily ever after. Boaz and Ruth have a son, Obed, who was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David the king. 3 women who didn't wait for someone to rescue them, but they took their lives into their own hands and did so successfully. But why would Matthew think these were important lessons for Christians? Because as much as the later church has downplayed women's leadership in its early days, women did lead a number of Christian communities. In no particular order, the ones I could find: Mary of Magdala, the apostle to the apostles; Phoebe, Junia with her husband Andronicus, and Chloe in Rome; Priscilla in both Rome and Cenchrea; Lydia also in 2 cities, Thyatira and Philippi; Philip's 4 unnamed daughters in Caesarea; Euodia and Syntyche in Ephesus; Nympha in Colossus; Mark's mother, another Mary, in Jerusalem; the noble lady unnamed to whom John addressed his 2nd letter. Matthew wanted these women and the men who objected to taking orders from a woman to know that they weren't anomalies, that their leadership had precedence in church history, that they were valuable in God's sight and were able to make useful contributions to their communities and to the church as a whole. It's something to remember, and not just on International Women's Day.